Welcome to this morning's meeting of the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee, and Happy New Year to everybody. Today is our fourth and penultimate session on protecting built heritage, and we are joined for our first panel by two representatives from Historic England. We have Emma Squire, CBE, who is the Co-Chief Executive Officer, and Ian Morrison, OBE, Director of Policy and Evidence. Welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us on this very chilly morning. Before I begin, I need to remind members at the point that you ask your questions to declare any interests. Emma, I would like to start with you. Welcome. Lovely to see you. You've been in post for 2 months now. Previously, you were in the department. What were the biggest challenges in your in-tray when you took the role?
I think there were more opportunities than challenges. Historic England is a really confident, high-performing organisation full of committed colleagues who are really expert and really understand the communities that they serve. But Claudia and I, on taking on the co-CEO role, see huge opportunities for Historic England and the historic environment to play an even bigger role in solving some of society's challenges. So we want to dial up the work that we do on heritage and growth, and specifically we see huge opportunities around converting historic buildings to help meet the housing supply, and we see huge opportunities around heritage skills. We have calculated that the economy could absorb an additional 105,000 roles per year every year to 2050 just to retrofit the fifth of housing that is traditional pre-1919. We also see a huge opportunity around place and the role of heritage in making characterful places that people feel proud to live in, and helping with community cohesion and pride in place. And then finally, we see an opportunity for Historic England to do even more in partnership with the wider heritage sector, sometimes leading, sometimes supporting, sometimes convening, to make sure that we have a seat at the table to really boost the voice for heritage in policy at every tier of government.
Previously, you had a role at the department, and heritage came under your area of responsibility, and now you're almost poacher turned gamekeeper, or the other way around. What was there anything about moving into the new role that surprised you, or that you're looking at from a different perspective since you've sort of changed roles?
Well, at DCMS, the focus was very much on heritage policy, and of course Historic England also plays a huge role when it comes to planning. So I think the areas that I needed to really get up the learning curve on were around planning, particularly given the government's focus on planning reform, and also the breadth of Historic England's input into other areas, whether it's environmental land management or net zero, our heritage science function, and all of the research partnerships we have with universities internationally. So those were all pleasant surprises for me on joining Historic England.
And do you think that is there a strong message that you'll be sort of sending back to your former colleagues in DCMS about, clearly you understand the opportunities of heritage, you've just spoken very clearly about what the opportunities are, but do you think those opportunities are understood across government? Do you think there's a stronger role for the department to make that case?
I do, and I think that the Heritage Minister, Baroness Twycross, can see it too. I think most people agree that heritage matters, but they see it as a bit niche and sort of over there. And we would really like heritage to be at the table, whether it's a discussion on skills, whether it's a discussion on public sector asset disposals, whether it's net zero, whether it's housing, because we think that will benefit the historic environment, but also help those other government departments to achieve their policy priorities. And of course, we can't do that without the support of the Department for Culture, Media and Sport.
Good, but those conversations need to be happening sort of government-wide, don't they?
Government-wide, yeah.
Yeah. When I said to you what were the biggest challenges in your in-tray, you very carefully, like a politician, diverted the question and talked to me about the opportunities. But surely one of the biggest challenges facing the heritage sector is the huge backlog of repairs and maintenance. What's Historic England's role in addressing that?
Yeah, so the biggest challenges for the sector are financial resilience, and that is both sort of cash flow, but also the maintenance backlog and the skills challenge. We see our role as helping to build the evidence base, providing technical expertise, providing some small grants. We were lucky enough to receive 15 million last year for heritage at risk capital grants, but that fund was 10 times oversubscribed. 3 in 4 heritage buildings open to the public. We believe their maintenance backlog is growing rather than reducing. We are trying to help the heritage sector with guidance, for example, on retrofit, so that they can reduce their costs, and when they're making interventions, make interventions that will also help with their sustainability. But yeah, a role in guidance, advice, funding, and advocacy to government.
If I can come in there as well.
Yes, of course.
In addition, we have a very strong role in terms of policy, so working with Ministry of Housing, Communities, Local Government to reform the planning system to make it easier for owners, stewards of historic buildings, making it easier for them to get permission to change them, to generate more income from them. So we've been working hard on reforms to the National Planning Policy Framework to encourage more positive decisions from local authorities who make most of the decisions around changes of use, changes of design to historic buildings, to make it easier for them to approve applications that will bring these buildings back into productive use.
Do you think that there is a greater role that Historic England can fulfil to provide more strategic leadership for the sector and more broadly?
Yeah, so we're already working closely with our partners across the heritage sector because we know we can't do this by ourselves. That's very, very clear. So we've been working with National Trust, the Heritage Fund, the Heritage Alliance, other key heritage organisations to develop a resilience plan for the sector, which we published last year, and that's built on 4 cornerstones of development. So making sure that heritage is relevant. If people don't see the benefits of heritage, then it's going to be very hard to get the funding that we need to bring them back into good condition. Making sure that the policy environment encourages productive reuse of historic buildings and historic places, so getting the policy environment right. One of the things I'm sure we'll come back to is making sure we've got the skilled workforce that we need, which is a massive issue and also an opportunity, as Emma said. And then finally, looking at the financial resilience of organisations. How can we help them help each other in terms of sharing services, for example, and finding new ways to bring in new sources of income to make them sustainable.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's move on to Rupa, please.
Hi, welcome. And congratulations, you're still in the honeymoon period, I guess, if it's
thank you.
The first few weeks. Yeah, I just want, thank you first of all, Historic England. I sort of often write to you when we've got local planning applications in conservation areas. How do you think, you're a statutory consultee, so councils have to go to you, but do you find that often, or sometimes, how would you say your relationship with local government is? Is it a bit patchy? Because quite often it tends to be ignored, what you're saying.
So generally very good, but obviously it depends on, our relationship with local authorities is different in every part of England. We respond to 17,000 planning applications a year. We give substantive comments in 28% of cases. We object to 1 in 100. And in 3/4 of the cases where we give substantive feedback, there are positive amendments made that better balance the commercial objectives of the developer and the historic environment. I would say that local authorities are really hard pressed. There's been over a 35% decline in the number of heritage experts in local planning authorities over recent years, so conservation officers, archaeologists, and that means that they're really up against it in many parts of the country, drinking from a fire hose in terms of dealing with their casework, and that can lead to delays, it can lead to over-reliance on consultants, it can lead to less consistency in decisions, it can lead to local planning authorities being more risk-averse than Historic England would have been. So we're really glad to see the 46 million announced for additional resources into local planning authorities, and we would very much hope that some of that will go into heritage expertise so that local planning authorities can not just be reactive but can also be proactive.
We also survey local authorities regularly, so every couple of years, to get an understanding of what they need from us as well, and we tailor our guidance and training accordingly to make sure that we're providing the services that they need from us to help improve their own decision making and within their local authorities. We also have a really good relationship with the Local Government Association, and a maturing relationship as well. And over the next few years, we'll be working closely with them to develop new training resources to support both officers and council members to make better decisions when faced with planning applications and other pressures.
And sort of how satisfied are you with the level of central government involvement in your work? I mean, if it's true that your objections can be overridden, and I mean, it sounds good that this money's coming, but it's true conservation officers have gone out of fashion. Actually, in our borough, we've brought it back in, I think it went in 2018, it came back in 2022. But, I mean, yeah, your relationship with the central government.
Yeah, I'll start and then I'll hand over to Ian. So we've got a really good relationship with MHCLG, and we, alongside DCMS, have been at the table as they've been considering the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, the revisions to the National Planning Policy Framework, and the review of statutory consultees. And we were really pleased to see the positive reference to Historic England in the review of statutory consultees. So we do feel that we have good dialogue, good and transparent and open and constructive dialogue with the policymakers in central government setting the regime, and that the revisions to the National Planning Policy Framework do broadly, while streamlining the planning system, maintain protections for the historic environment. Where we object, where we call in or take part in a public inquiry, that's always a last resort. And almost always it is where the developer has not talked to us before they've spent a lot of time and money on their planning application. So the message that we are really trying to get out to developers is to talk to us early, because then they can come forward with a scheme that we won't object to and de-risk their scheme and ultimately save time and money.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. So we have a very, very close relationship with Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. We meet weekly together with our own department officials to discuss areas around planning policy, statutory consultee reform, planning skills, for example. But we also have good relations with other government departments, particularly DESNES and with DEFRA as well. So we've been advising DESNES on the Warm Homes Plan and the retrofit of existing historic properties. And we've also been working with DEFRA very closely, and actually we are a DEFRA delivery body in terms of producing support for rural landscape, the management of rural landscape, including monuments within it.
What more do you think you would need from the government to support your work? Because, I mean, there is a danger in an era of build, that this heritage stuff is seen as a bit of a luxury. And there have been cases of maladministration found by the Ombudsman where people didn't take it seriously and there were poor decisions taken.
Yeah, so I think it's a continuation of the journey that we're on with government. So we've worked particularly well with MHCLG over the recent years around the reform of planning. And we want to see that continue. We know that heritage is really important. And actually we've seen perhaps a bit of a sea change in terms of recognition of the value of heritage through the polling that was done for Levelling Up, etc., where heritage scored extremely highly in terms of how people viewed how important it was to their sense of place, their pride in place. And that has translated into government policy. So we see, for example, the new Pride in Place programme that the government is delivering. We saw it through the Levelling Up funds, through the Town Fund. The heritage was a very key feature, a key criteria for those funding streams. And that's something we want to see continue. I think an area where we're particularly keen to develop further relations to see better progress is around skills. That's an area that we think, as we've said, huge challenges but huge opportunities.
And one really specific answer to your question, every part of the country will be producing a new strategic plan, so a new spatial plan at once. So this is for both strategic authorities and mayors, but also central government, to make sure that local authorities and Historic England are resourced for that short burst of activity. Sorry. So that the historic environment is properly factored into spatial plans, and the developments that come forward are more likely to be right first time.
Brilliant, thanks.
Super. Let's move on to Natasha, please.
Happy New Year. I'm just going to ask a little bit about sort of funding, and obviously whenever anyone comes to this committee, funding is always, whatever sector it is, there's always something around funding. So What changes are needed to the funding models to make heritage organisations more financially resilient?
There are major funders. The Heritage Lottery Fund is a key one. We play a small part in that too. So more funding for maintenance and would obviously be welcome. I think the sector themselves would say that maintenance is one challenge, but core operating expenditure is another. And they've seen a decline in local authority grants. They've seen an increase in their costs, and they've seen a reduction in visitor income. And most funding, our own funding, Heritage Lottery funding, is project-based and more about capital. So there is a challenge around core funding to open the doors, switch on the lights and welcome people to heritage sites that we will be looking at. And we fund, as Ian said, the Historic Environment Forum, who have been working on a 10-year sector resilience strategy that is partly about self-help and how heritage organisations can diversify their own income streams and be more sustainable. But part of the challenge for us as the government's advisor on heritage is to think about where there are market failures and how to advise government on addressing those.
I'd just like to add 2 points to that. So the first is that we've seen huge levels of investment into heritage through the funds that I mentioned, the Pride in Place, Levelling Up Funds, Towns Fund, and that's been hugely welcome. There has been an issue around it being fairly short-term in nature and unpredictable, and that makes it very hard to plan for long-term investment in heritage sites and in heritage organisations, and that has been particularly acute on the skills side, but it has kind of caused concerns for heritage organisations. The other thing about heritage organisations, and I've worked in the heritage sector for 40 odd years, so I'm quite familiar with it, is heritage organisations tend to be very much hand to mouth and have been very entrepreneurial and responded to various challenges they've had. But I think the challenges over the last few years, particularly since the pandemic, the headwinds of rising costs, maintenance costs, changing climate, increased salary costs, etc., they have sort of come together to create a real complex issue and challenging issue for heritage organisations. And I think, as Emma said, that lack of core funding is becoming a really significant issue for many heritage organisations. So thinking about how we address that is going to be, I think, probably one of the greatest challenges we face over the next few years.
More of a focus on long-term stability rather than necessarily a massive, obviously we've got more money, but it's more not just pumping more money into it, it's the kind of long-termism of it rather than the sort of
exactly. Because the other downside of I don't sound ungrateful for the huge amount of resources, it's been very, very welcome, but the short-term nature also creates inflationary pressures because there isn't the skilled workforce to be able to use that funding and effectively, and that pushes up prices, and of course that then compounds the issues that heritage organisations are facing.
And with the recent budget, what was the impact on the sector out the back of the recent budget?
So the most recent budget, I suppose there were two measures that impact the sector. One was on agricultural property relief, business property relief, and I know some changes were made to that just before Christmas, to the thresholds. But at the time, the Historic Houses Association felt that would affect a significant proportion of operators of historic houses who rely on those reliefs for their business model. The other is the council tax surcharge, and we'll look at that and understand what implications that might have for the care and maintenance of historic buildings and respond to the consultation.
So, just going back to that point around making things more long-term and a bit more stable, so how could government change its funding structures then to encourage long-termism rather than the sort of little projects that people are talking about?
Yeah, well, I think the multi-year spending review will be part of that. It's 3 years for resource and 5 years for capital, so that will give a bit of a planning horizon, particularly if local authorities can also give that kind of multi-year certainty to the organisations that they support. Some programmes are even longer than that, so the Pride in Place, 5 billion for Pride in Place, which has heritage front and centre, is a 10-year programme for 200-odd communities. Decisions by policymakers that are longer term will give that planning horizon. Fiscal incentives obviously are more long term too, and I'm sure you will have heard discussion around VAT for repair and reuse of historic buildings. So some of those fiscal incentives do give the longer term signalling that helps for planning.
What sort of response have you had conversations with the government about the VAT issue? We know the Treasury are very reluctant to ever talk about any changes to VAT. It's one of the most common asked things from all sorts of different sectors. But have you had any inkling that this is a case where there is a really good argument for this?
I think there's a really good argument for it because the government has really ambitious housing targets, and at the moment repurposing existing historic buildings that are really characterful, that offer wider public value in terms of regenerating neighbourhoods, in terms of capturing that embodied carbon and contributing to net zero, are disincentivised because of the 20% VAT that's payable compared to zero for new build. Lots of other countries use VAT to incentivise repair and reuse of historic buildings: France, Germany, Portugal, Spain, Cyprus, Iceland. We know that the UK faces a particular unique challenge in terms of housing supply and tight public finances, and that the Treasury don't think that the case has been made for a blanket exemption, but we would like to work with and through DCMS on perhaps more targeted exemptions for certain asset classes or certain types of owners or certain types of building that can help the government to achieve its wider housing targets and encourage buildings to be reused to the benefit of local communities.
One of our evidence sessions, someone said, it seems madness that you can pull down an old building and pay no VAT on a new build to replace it, and yet have to pay VAT on the refurb and maintenance of an historic building. Surely the Treasury see the sense in that, don't they?
Our medium to longer term ambition would be to resolve that and to at least equalise, if not incentivise, repurposing old buildings. But in the short term, we'll look at something that might be more achievable and building the evidence base and the case that meets Treasury Green Book principles for a more targeted intervention, as well as publicising reliefs that already exist for empty housing that's been empty for more than 2 years. For example, I don't think that's widely understood that there are reliefs available.
And then when it comes to getting more money into the system, do you think that Historic England have a role of helping bring private investors into the heritage sector? I mean, to what extent is that part of your remit?
So I think we can put in some of the shoe leather and do some of the policy thinking on this. We'll never be a major player because we're not a major funder, but we're really keen to work with Homes England, with the new National Housing Bank, with developers, with investors, to try and be really creative and come up with solutions, because where it works is where there is a blended finance model like Stockport Development Corporation bringing forward Weir Mill for housing with a blend of the Mayor's brownfield funding, some Homes England grants, some loan finance, and then some private investment. So we think that we could play a role in helping to come up with some models that could work in partnership with organisations like Homes England. And then at much smaller scale, we can work with local areas on smaller numbers of units, so homes above the shop that will also drive footfall to high streets. And we already offer to underwrite local authorities who want to use enforcement powers like urgent works notices to help them de-risk that. So we're doing a pilot with the West Midlands Combined Authority and other partners in Dudley around stopping the rot, for example, to show how we could help to unlock the reclamation of empty historic buildings that are not being brought forward for development.
On that, after you, we're going to be hearing from the MOJ, MOD and others who have an enormous amount of historic buildings under their remit but don't seem to have any responsibility to maintain or repair them. I mean, what more can Historic England do in that field? Right,
so in 2017 we published a protocol on the care of the historic government estate, and we would love every part of government to fully implement that protocol. It includes really practical, straightforward things like having a heritage officer, regular condition surveys and so on. We can provide advice on specific sites, and we can also provide advice on responsible asset disposal, because what is always a real shame is when the public sector disposes of an asset to a buyer for the best price, but a buyer who may not bring it forward, who may just sit on it to bank the land value, or may have unrealistic expectations of the value. I visited Dover Western Heights recently, where there's a former MOJ prison, which is at the heart of the local authority's master plan, and it was sold to a developer who had really unrealistic expectations, has not been able to bring it forward. The building continues to deteriorate, the viability gap increases, the local authority can't achieve their master planning ambitions for housing growth. So we have already opened discussions with the Government Property Office on refreshing our guidance for responsible public asset disposals. And with any part of the public sector that is managing historic assets, we stand ready to provide advice on both managing those assets and disposing of them.
It must be really distressing for an organisation like yours that the whole ethos of what you do is protecting our built heritage, is preserving it for future generations, to look around you and see that under the auspices of government departments, there are bits of our national heritage that are rotting at public expense. That must be distressing.
It is. I don't want to over-egg it though. So we do a biennial review. 19 government departments and arm's length bodies participate in that. Between them, they manage 6,000 heritage assets, and 2% of those heritage assets were at risk, according to our most recent published biennial review. So it's a small proportion, but of course, any is a shame, particularly where regular maintenance could just at least maintain them at their current standards so that they're more easy to bring back into use in the future.
Not only bring back into use in the future, but when they're disposed of, and other organisations or companies end up buying them, it costs a huge amount to bring them back into just the legally minimum acceptable standard, right? So and in some cases this is also public money, and I think of my own constituency, which I know you visited. There's a building that was allowed to rot to such an extent by the MOD that it took a huge grant from Historic England to bring it back into use, for the sake of maintaining, for the sake of clearing gutters, for the sake of repairing a roof tile. Hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of Historic England, which is public money or lottery money or whatever is going to that. It just feels like a terrible false economy.
I agree, and I think adherence to that 2017 protocol would make a real difference there. As well as we do understand that different government departments and arm's length bodies, their primary focus is their operational responsibilities. They happen to have heritage assets, some of which are operationally necessary, some of which are not. So we do understand that it's an afterthought, but adherence to those protocols would help to reduce waste and maximise public value. As would, in some cases, perhaps taking a step back and having a team that can take a strategic overview of all of the historic assets and which ones might be good for disposal or which should be prioritised for maintenance. And again, we can help with that.
And at the moment, there doesn't seem to be any incentive to dispose of these things. They're just, the incentive is just to let them rot into the ground. Thank you. Jo.
Thank you. Hi, good morning. Just to declare an interest, I used to manage a Grade 2 star listed building. You've heard it all before, at Lee Spinners Mill in my constituency of Lee and Alberton. So knowing the process a little bit, so in particular the listed building consent process, which can be very, very timely and costly. So what reforms could improve that process without compromising heritage protection?
Let me speak that up. Yeah. So there are two principal issues to deal with. The first one is around policy. So making sure that we get that proportion right, the balance right in terms of the amount of information that's required to be submitted in order to get listed building consent, finding mechanisms for removing the need to get listed building consent for those kind of low-hanging fruit works which are unlikely to affect the real significance of the building. So we're very keen on local listed building consent orders. We're working with a number of local authorities to bring that forward, whereby works for, particularly for making energy efficiency improvements to historic buildings, for example, wouldn't need to go through a formal consent process. So that would speed up the system. And also we're in discussions continue to be in discussions with central government about national listed building consent orders and bringing those forward to help streamline the system and make it easier for owners and developers to apply for listed building consent. The other area, frankly, is around skills and local authorities. So we're investing a huge amount of resource in terms of training programs, online training programs, to build the skills and capacity of local planning authorities, particularly, so that they can more quickly determine applications and give the right response. Now, we do know that 93% of listed building consent applications are approved. But where the real issue is that 38% of them are only approved within the 8-week window. And so there is a real issue there around speeding up the process, giving confidence to local planning authorities to make the right decisions, be very clear when consent is needed and when it isn't, and also to find other ways of streamlining the system.
And how receptive have government been with regards to your approach?
Yes, very receptive. So the recognising the skills deficit, particularly in conservation services and local planning authorities, that's something that the MHCLG do accept, and the various proposals that are coming through to address planning skills fund, for example, do include heritage conservation skills in order to try and bring those forward. We're also working with the Local Government Association to take advantage of their new planning skills programmes to try and build that capacity. Where we are struggling to make progress at the moment is around the National Listed Building Consent Order, because I just don't think that
Say that again,
where we're struggling to make progress is with the National Listed Building Consent Order. So, just because at the moment you need parliamentary approval to get a National Listed Building Consent Order through, and that finding parliamentary time to get those through is quite challenging. We've had one on the books for the Canals and Rivers Trust for several years, and it still hasn't made it through.
So what's the blockage on that?
It requires parliamentary approval at the moment.
Affirmative resolution. So
So
parliamentary time.
Yeah, and at the moment trying to get parliamentary time is very difficult because
there's no statutory instrument in that, is it?
No.
So we're seeking to change
Thursday.
from an affirmative resolution to a negative resolution, and that's something that I know.
That's a statutory instrument.
Yeah.
So it's not even primary legislation.
Not primary legislation, no.
It'd be hard, really, should it?
Well, we're on a one-line wet today.
That's a reform.
Absolutely.
Is there any other reforms that you notably require?
I think just keeping that visibility of the skills deficit in local planning authorities, trying to address that significant decline. I mean, it has plateaued in recent years, but we are looking, as Emma said, 35% decline from the high point 2006. So it is something that we really want to address. We want to build that confidence back in local planning authorities. We know from speaking to developers that is one of the biggest frustrations, and of course you've experienced it yourself. So trying to resolve that, trying to get local planning authorities skilled up to be able to make better planning decisions and quicker planning decisions is fundamental.
Just to explain why that matters, of the 400,000 listed buildings, 93% of them are listed at grade 2. So the listed building consent is for the local planning authority. Historic England only get involved for grade 2 star and grade 1. So the vast majority of these decisions are for the local planning authority who lack the capacity.
Absolutely. Okay. So also in your evidence, you mentioned the effectiveness of community ownership. Again, to declare that interest, it was something that we benefited from at Spinners Mill. So what additional measures could accompany asset transfer or community ownership? So is it financial support or guidance to make sure buildings remain viable and protected?
So I'll say a couple of things and then hand over to Ian. So the government put an additional $5 million into the Architectural Heritage Fund last year to support building preservation trusts to look at the feasibility of and then to take on cherished local buildings. So that kind of model where there's support for feasibility work, to know that your business model is going to work if you do manage to go through with the project is really important. We have just published, I think, some guidance on community ownership and community use. So we also see a role for Historic England in terms of guidance, how-to guides, toolkits. So both of those things are key.
Yeah, so just to clarify, we've just launched a community hub on our website, which is providing those resources for local community groups, because I think one of the key things is, there are there's a lot of passion for heritage in local communities, as you well know, and sometimes that passion can lead to a bit of blindness around some of the kind of practical realities of what it means to take on historic building. We know that in many cases communities are best placed to look after historic buildings, so finding ways in which we can support them is by providing that advice and guidance so that they can go into this the transfer process with open eyes and know what's involved, what they're taking on, and how to manage that situation. We are updating our guidance. We produced something called Pillars of the Community, which we produced with a range of organisations, including the Heritage Fund and the Architectural Heritage Fund. And I think actually the other key thing is working in partnership with the Architectural Heritage Fund, with the Heritage Fund, and with the National Trust and other organisations to provide that sort of umbrella of support for those organisations, because they're going to be critical for looking after our heritage.
I always say I have a blueprint of what not to do if you ever need that. Can I just ask something else just to add on to that as well, which not necessarily directly involved in, but it happened in the constituency, which was the Heritage Action Zone. I know government and DCMS are looking at the benefits of what happened within that particular scheme. Is there anything that you'd want to contribute with regards to that project?
We are incredibly proud of the High Street Heritage Action Zone programme that supported 67 high streets across England. The Tildesley High Street Heritage Action Zone was one of the particularly special ones because it was community-led, as was Hastings and one or two others, rather than local authority-led. And it's a huge success. And Ian Tomlinson is a huge friend of Historic England now and a brilliant advocate for the power of small amounts of money, convening local businesses, community groups, to restore shop fronts, to improve public realm, to bring buildings back into use, to put homes above the shop, to drive cultural programming through, to bring people back to their high street. We published what we think is a best-in-class evaluation. It was a really, really thorough evaluation of the High Street Heritage Action Zone programme, so that we could bottle and understand what worked and really demonstrate what impact that programme had. And part of the learnings from that have fed into the community hub and other resources that we make available to people that want to replicate that. And we're trying to keep going with that model in a smaller way now the programme is finished. So there is a Heritage Action Zone in Bradford as part of the legacy of their year as City of Culture, for example.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jo. Let's move on to Jeff.
On the sort of wider benefits that you talked about, in your written evidence you've mentioned the spillover benefits, things like tourism, regeneration, volunteering, skills, cultural identity. They're quite hard to quantify, aren't they? But in order to make a case for sustained public investment, you need to try and do that. So how can you demonstrate those benefits? Is it possible to demonstrate those benefits?
Yes, yeah. Well, actually, that is one of the big challenges. Is how do you kind of monetize those softer benefits of heritage and make the case for investment? And recognising that challenge, we're working very closely with Department of Culture, Media and Sport to take forward the Cultural and Heritage Capital Programme, and that's precisely designed to try and quantify those benefits, those softer benefits in harder monetary terms. That is going to be a long-term process. We are producing, so we're a contributory to that programme. We're bringing forward new pieces of evidence, new pieces of research periodically. Last year we published some of the well-being benefits of living close to a heritage asset, which we, using Green Book compliant methods, we estimated to be worth 29 billion a year to the country. So it's through those sorts of bespoke bits of research, but building that broader evidence base to replicate effectively what the natural world have been doing for some time through the natural accounting, capital accounting approach.
Okay. Are there any lessons from abroad that we can take? Is anybody else doing it?
Yes, so we worked closely with our partners in Europe around looking at bringing together a whole raft of different research reports that have demonstrated what the benefits more broadly in culture rather specifically in heritage. There's a lot of work being done in places like University of Milan, for example, in terms of estimating of working out what the benefits are of heritage-led regeneration, for example. And yes, we continue to work closely with partners both across Europe but also in America to understand what those benefits might be. But of course, places are very different, countries are very different, and circumstances are very different. So what might work and show up in America might not be the same in the UK.
But I'd say the work the UK is leading on culture and heritage capital is world leading, and there's a lot of global interest. So we're showing real thought leadership globally. Remember at DCMS, one of the early conferences on culture and heritage capital had 350 attendees dialing in from across the globe, wanting to understand how we can value the non-monetisable costs and benefits of culture and heritage.
Okay. And what about, excuse me, I suppose more local partnerships? How can Historic England convene or encourage partnerships with local authorities, with social investors to capture those benefits?
Yes, so this is quite a complex answer to this. So there's lots of different layers of engagement. We're particularly keen at the moment to engage with the new strategic authorities and the new mayors to understand, because given all of their new powers and responsibilities for growth, for regeneration, for example, and a lot of them are very, very interested in the value of heritage that heritage can bring. So working with them to ensure that heritage is embedded in their local growth plans, for example, is really important. That's a kind of foundational requirement to set the kind of set the path to see how heritage can help, deliver some of those wider economic and social and environmental benefits to the region. More locally, all of our 80% of our staff are based out in the region, so they work locally with local authorities, with community organisations like Lee Spinners Mill and others, in order to build those, both at an individual project level and sometimes more at a local authority-wide level. We've invested quite a lot in local heritage strategies, for example, with local authorities. So it's a multi-layered approach, but where I think we're quite excited at the moment is about working with the new mayors and the new strategic authorities to really kind of show how heritage can help them deliver some of those benefits for their communities.
Thank you, Jeff. So let's move on to Vicky, please.
Okay, thank you. My questions are around adapting to climate change. So Historic England advocates a whole building approach to energy efficiency in historic properties. How does this approach differ from the conventional retrofit strategies?
Yeah, so the government is changing its approach on this. So I should say, so there used to be a fabric first approach, so which is where you take the assumption that you can reduce energy bills by putting for example, wall insulation on. If you just put wall insulation on a traditionally built building without thinking about how that building performs more generally, so how the ventilation works, then that can lead to unintended consequences such as increased damp, increased mould, and of course we've seen huge examples of that now through all of those early sort of retrofit schemes that were brought forward by the government, actually because a whole building approach wasn't taken at that time. We are seeing some of the consequences of that sort of playing out. It's buildings are kind of they function as a whole, and you need to be able to understand how the buildings function as a whole, so you make the right interventions in the right places. That requires a level of skill. So we're doing a lot of work around trying to, so we build that kind of skills base. There's a lot more work to do. We don't have enough skilled people in this country to address some of those challenges. But we, along with our partner agencies in Wales and Scotland, have recently produced a handbook on retrofit targeted at level 3 apprenticeship. So to show how you would approach the sensible and appropriate retrofit of historic buildings, traditionally built buildings.
Can I make 3 additional points? One of our asks of Skills England is for there to be a module in level 2 and level 3 construction training that is about traditional materials and traditional buildings, because a significant proportion of the construction sector, when surveyed, said that they didn't feel confident in looking at energy efficiency for traditionally built buildings, and 1/5 of the housing stock and 1/3 of commercial buildings are pre-1919. There's something around energy performance certificates and the methodology by which those are looked at, which overestimates heat loss for traditional buildings, so they're not a fair reflection of performance. And then there is something around embodied carbon, coming back to the VAT discussion and things like that, where embodied carbon isn't fully taken into account. So new build is incentivised rather than reusing existing buildings, existing materials. And the new draft National Planning Policy Framework does talk about reuse of structures and materials because of the carbon benefits, and that's a really welcome development.
Brilliant. And so, what are the risks if this approach is not taken?
So the risks if the approach isn't taken is that we'll see more of what's happened in the past, which was coming forward now. So more kind of well-intended retrofit measures, but which actually aren't creating the energy efficiency improvements that were anticipated, and actually can lead to damage to historic fabric, and also pose a threat to the health of the occupants. So we think it's absolutely vital that there is much more understanding of how buildings perform, particularly traditional buildings, which perform differently to modern constructed buildings. And as Emma said, we have the largest historic building stock in Europe. So this is really, really important. And the amount of money that's spent on repairs and maintenance of our buildings, 40% of that is currently spent on our traditional buildings. The buildings are built over, and we've got about 6.5 million of them in England. It's a lot of buildings over 100 years old. So it's vital that we have the skills and understanding about how to retrofit them appropriately.
Yeah, and so particularly on that, what practical steps are being taken to make sure that we have got those skills in terms of contractors and so forth? Yeah,
so we, as I said, we are doing our bit in terms of producing the advice and guidance. I think it's fair to say that we've still got some work to do with government to get them to embed, as Emma just said, understanding of how traditional buildings perform and how you deal them into traditional mainstream construction courses. There's another kind of fairly bleak picture. So there are currently 79 sort of heritage construction related training courses. 48 of them currently are not being offered by colleges or independent training providers. So there is a real deficit at the moment in terms of that availability of training to make sure that we've got the skilled workforce that we need to do retrofit properly.
And just one final question. In terms of what does good look like, do we know what that is now?
Yeah, so we have a good understanding of what good looks like. We published last year a very detailed skills needs assessment of the heritage construction sector, and it's a fairly bleak reading actually, other than it says the opportunity is great. The current situation is really challenging. The heritage construction sector is largely made up of small and medium enterprises who lack the resources to invest in long-term apprenticeships, for example. Now, we've seen some changes through the apprenticeship levy, but they don't yet meet the needs of those smaller organisations. We need to find a mechanism whereby we can offer more flexible opportunities for those small and medium enterprises to bring in new recruits to their workforce, train them up, and then make sure that we've got that workforce for the future. There are other really big opportunities, not least the Restoration and Renewal Programme, which is going to need around about 2,800 skilled craftsmen if it's taken forward in full. That creates a huge opportunity. We would love to see that used as a mechanism for bringing forward a new sort of cohort of skilled practitioners.
And then just one tiny little question, which is just in terms of where you've got it and it looks good, do we know how much you can kind of save in terms of energy costs and so forth? Like, is there calculations in terms of that?
Yeah, I mean, it varies from building to building, but we have a huge amount of technical advice and guidance on our website, and it dispels the myths, for example. So we know from our own research that heat pumps work really effectively in historic buildings, whereas the perception is that they don't. They really do, as long as they are specified correctly, installed correctly, and then used correctly. Those are the kind of three golden rules, and it's surprising how often those three rules aren't followed because of the lack of skills and lack of knowledge. So we know that also by retrofitting a historic building, you're going to get far greater savings in carbon emissions than you are by demolishing and building new as well. So it's much better for the planet.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Damien.
Thank you. A number of the things you've talked about on workforce issues for the heritage sector sound very like the workforce issues of the construction sector in general. What's different about your issues?
So it is absolutely brilliant that 600 million has been announced to support construction skills, but it is very focused on new builds, and it's very hard for heritage construction businesses to access because, as Ian said, around 3/4 are micro businesses with less than 10 employees. So carving out the time to both train people and
that industry structure thing about contractors to contractors and SMEs, that is true for construction in general as well as for heritage. I'm trying to understand what's the additional issue that you have in your part of the sector?
It's the ecosystem. So it is the careers guidance to encourage people to take up places on courses so that those courses are sustainable. It's the provision of courses in the places where people live. There's only 4 stonemason apprenticeships available in England. There's only 1 post-excavation archaeology opportunity anywhere in England. And then it's the training placements, and then it's the kind of career progression. So it's that sort of whole ecosystem, and understanding what is special, what is sort of different about, and then back to that point on longer term certainty, the signal to heritage construction organisations that there is sufficient pipeline to be worth growing and to take on and take the risk of taking on trainees. That we are trying to solve for that ecosystem challenge.
Can I just say, but you're absolutely right. So some of the challenges are very, very similar across the construction industry. Our issue, though, is that what is currently being done to address some of those challenges is not necessarily taking into account what the skills that are needed for understanding how traditional buildings perform and how they need to be maintained. So what we want to see is that kind of knowledge around how traditional buildings perform embedded in new approaches to address the challenge that the construction sector faces as a whole.
Is that, Emma, the pipeline question that you mentioned, is that really the fundamental point? Because, I mean, the volume of places on apprenticeship courses, match demand. They will be provided where employers want to take on apprentices and young people and others want to become apprentices. But the fundamental point is, will the employment opportunities be there in those volumes? Is that really the key point? The long-term visibility, big projects like Houses of Parliament, restoration and renewal obviously is a huge thing, but all these other projects, you need to know more earlier about what is going to be coming down the line.
Yeah, so pipeline is really, really important, and that's a real challenge, and that's where I come back to the issue around the short-term nature of capital funding. So without that kind of certainty, those SMEs are unlikely to invest in the time it takes to train an apprentice, or indeed, provide any training for a new workforce. So we know from our skills needs assessment, and we'll send a copy of this. I won't go through all of it in detail, take too long, but I'll send a copy of the executive summary to the committee. But it does show that the heritage SMEs, construction SMEs, they're actually turning down work. Because they don't have the skilled workforce to do it, and where they are picking up work, they're charging a premium because they can charge a premium, and that's putting costs up for lots of organisations. So, and they're not incentivised to bring on young people. And we've got this kind of the heritage construction workforce is particularly notable for its demographic age. So it's very, very rare to have people younger than 35 working in the heritage construction businesses, and that is surely a real issue that needs to be addressed.
Just to give you the stats, 76% of heritage construction organisations can't find people with relevant skills when they go out to market, and 1 in 6 are turning down work due to skills shortages. Conversely, so we're not maintaining the current workforce, and conversely, as I said earlier, we think there's an additional 105,000 jobs in the economy every year between now and 2050 if we want to hit our net zero targets and give people warmer homes to retrofit traditional buildings.
Can I just come back quickly to the VAT question? So this VAT on new build versus conversion has been around in public policy for literally as long as I can remember, and there'll probably be a committee sitting in this room in 30 years' time having the same conversation. I mean, and by the way, we also have conversations with lots of other sectors about VAT, whether it's about comedy, live music, hospitality. I mean, there are lots and lots of good arguments for lots and lots of sectors to have exemptions from VAT. And that is why Treasury Ministers never, ever concede the point, because when you concede one, there's a whole queue of others who also have a very good case to make. So who is making the case for an alternative to cutting VAT on converting historic premises in order to level the playing field between conversion and new build?
Sorry, on an alternative?
Yes. So if you can't do it by cutting the VAT rates on conversion, what else could you do instead to make to level the field between the two?
So that is exactly the kind of thing that we are looking at in policy terms and in discussion with DCMS, Homes England, MHCLG. So what are the barriers to converting? What's the full range of policy levers that could be used? VAT is one of them. EPCs is another. Blended finance models could be another. Grant funding from Homes England or the National Lottery Heritage Fund to de-risk and cornerstone developments could be. So we are looking at the full range, and we're also doing this work on culture and heritage capital, because part of the challenge is that commercial developers don't benefit from the full public benefits of converting existing buildings. Those benefits derive to local communities and local areas, and they're just looking at the commercial viability, and they don't factor in those wider public benefits. So how can we demonstrate what those wider public benefits are, so that there is a public policy rationale for doing something, whether that's VAT or another lever.
So just to pick up on that specific point. So we've held many sort of round tables with developers from across the country to understand what their challenges are. They will quite often say that part of the challenges is capacity in local authorities, as we've already mentioned, but also the other big challenge is around viability. It is actually quite expensive to bring some historic buildings back into use, and the economics don't always stack up. And that is partly a challenge of policy as much as around sort of fiscal reform. So through some of the changes that we've been working with MHCLG for on the changes to the National Planning Policy framework, we're seeking to make it easier in terms of more pragmatic, to bring forward new uses for vacant historic buildings. That will help to a degree, but it's not the only answer.
Thanks, Damien. Bye.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. I want to sort of touch on the skills element again, and that sort of gap. Conservation societies. I wanted to talk about that. In my constituency of South and Eastern Rochford, there's a couple that I've worked with, the Milton Society and the sort of Rochford Steering Group as well. So they've both been quite active at sort of reanimating some local sort of community assets, and working closely with the council. So, Ian, you were talking about a layered approach, and there's a capacity issue with a lot of local authorities. So, I suppose this is an observation and also a question. So, what I wanted to know is, in terms of feeding into this ecosystem and supporting it, conservation societies, what part do they play? Obviously, you've got architects, builders, historians within these local micro groups. So do you see a way of that kind of construct supporting the work that we need to do to get these assets back? And if so, is there a way where we can support those sort of conservation groups and societies, be it funding? By default, they will then feed in and support their local authorities as well. So observation and the question, it'd be interesting to hear what both of you think about that.
Yeah, so absolutely. Communities going to play a very important and increasing role in looking after heritage assets, and it's how we support them to do that. There is a very well-established network of historic building preservation trusts across the country that have been doing some of this work for many years, and it was being supported through organisations like the Architectural Heritage Fund, who can offer them both advice, on the ground advice, but also some seed funding. So in terms of looking at project viability and then bringing forward project development plans to actually make it realistic in terms of how they might then access larger sums of funding that are needed, for example, from the Heritage Fund. So it's quite a complex ecosystem, but finding the right mechanisms and the right support, depending on what local circumstances, is actually is absolutely key. Architectural Heritage Fund, they as an organisation, I should declare I used to work with the Architectural Heritage Fund. They've been providing that support for local communities now for over 50 years, and they've done a huge amount of bringing forward helping those communities bring forward those assets into community ownership and develop them for community use. That's work that we've been working hard with them to try and develop and continue. We hope that we can continue to support them going forward, working with DCMS. We think it's really important that we continue to provide advice and guidance for local groups, so that they're aware, as I said earlier, of what they're taking on, so that they do go into this open-eyed. And I think it's also beholden upon us to work with other funders to try and make it as simple as possible for them to access funding. Because I was struck by visiting Hastings Commons, which is a classic example of where a community group is taking on a number of historic buildings for beneficial community use, where they're applying to 100 plus different grant funders and having to apply, fill in several different grant forms and then provide lots of monitoring reports. That's really difficult for those communities. So I think there is a role for us as funders to work together to make sure we make it as simple as possible for those organisations to access the funding that they need to bring those projects forward.
Yeah, thank you. Emma, anything you'd like to add to that?
No, just that back to the earlier discussion on skills and building preservation trusts, there probably is a kernel of an idea around the heritage sector coming together to help place people into apprenticeships, so that small organisations like building preservation trusts and like micro heritage construction businesses can more easily access short-term apprentices, and those apprentices can have a range of experiences. So that is something that we're beginning to look at. And like the Architectural Heritage Fund, we do on occasion support local conservation groups. We put some money recently into Reform in Stoke to allow them to bring forward a project in a really special building, I think it's the Bethesda Methodist Chapel. So we complement what the Architectural Heritage Fund do to try and provide seed funding for feasibility studies or for actual capital works for groups like the ones you described.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bayo. Okay, I've got a couple quick fire questions for you before we let you escape. Christchurch Lancaster submitted some evidence which they suggested that there was an early intervention system which they call a pre-risk register to identify heritage assets who are on the brink of deterioration before they get to the stage where they would be on the heritage at risk register. Good idea, bad idea?
Good idea.
Good idea. You'd back that. Second thing, we're about to meet representatives MOJ, MOD and public estates. What would be the one thing that you would want us to ask them that would change the playing field in terms of their ability to maintain their public estate?
I don't know if it's a question to ask them. I suppose it's more of a recommendation, which is strict adherence to the protocol, and bring us in to help take a strategic overview of historic estates that might be ripe for asset disposal.
Okay, final question. We're going to write a report on this, which will go to the government. What would be the one game-changing recommendation you would have us ask the government for that would really help Historic England to be able to deliver a better future for the historic estate?
Well, I have three.
Good, excellent.
So the first is heritage having a seat at the table, because heritage can help solve lots of societal challenges, public sector asset disposals, new homes, meaningful jobs for young people where they live, net zero. So really involving us. Where we're involved, like Pride in Place, it's made a big difference. Second is sector resilience, so back to skills and financial resilience. Can we work together to for the sector to help itself, but also for government policies to support that? And I've forgotten the third.
Well, I'll add two if that's all. So we've already covered these to an extent, but I think it's
local authority capacity.
Local authority capacity, yeah. So for me, the two, in addition to the three that Emma's mentioned, the two is around addressing that long-term capital funding, so that it's stable and consistent, contiguous, not volatile, because that will enable heritage organisations to plan more effectively moving forward, and I think that's really vital. And then the second one is around skills. We absolutely have to address the skills challenge, because if we don't, we're not going to have the workforce that we need to look after our heritage, and that will continue to see it deteriorate and to continue to see prices driving up.
Very good. Ian, Emma, thank you very much for your time today. Thank you for giving us all your expertise, and we're just going to take a very short break while we let you leave and we bring in our second panel. Thank you. Order. Welcome to our second panel this morning, and for this panel we're looking at the current condition of the government estate and how it's been protected. And to talk us through that, we're joined by Mark Bourgeois, who is the Chief Executive of the Government Property Agency in the Cabinet Office, by Richard McSeveney, who is the Chief Property Officer at the Ministry of Justice, and by Major General Andy Sturrock, who's the Director of Strategy and Plans at the Defence Infrastructure Organisation in the Ministry of Defence. You're all very welcome. I'm going to start the questioning with you, Major General Sturrock. Several submissions you may have read in the evidence that we've received so far have identified the maintenance of heritage assets on our public land as being of significant concern. Now, Historic England identified the MOJ and so I'll be coming to you in a minute, Richard, but the MOJ and the MOD as being some of the worst culprits when it comes to the accountability and the enforcement of protecting their heritage assets. Major General Sturrock, how much of the MOD's estate is currently in this position of managed decline that we hear a lot about?
So I don't think we'd recognise the term as managed decline as a sort of positive policy action. Certainly as far as our buildings are concerned and our heritage buildings, we are keen to look after them. And the Ministry of Defence, the military, is an institution that's founded on history, on ethos. The military, the conceptual and moral components of fighting power are sort of built on that foundation of a long history, and those historic buildings play a part in that. So places like Sandhurst, our naval bases, RAF Digby, one of the first RAF bases, lots of the RAF operate off Second World War bases that were founded at the time of the beginning of the RAF. So that's all part of our need to deliver operational and military output. And we want to look after all our buildings, whether they are new or whether they are historic, as best we can. But there is a reality that budgets don't stretch as far as we would wish, and therefore there's a question of prioritisation. So where we can use historic buildings for operational purposes, then they are well looked after, or as looked after as the rest of our estate. The trouble that we come across is where there is an inability to use a building, or it's difficult to repurpose a building for operational use. And then it does become harder to look after it, because the prioritisation of funding for those assets will inevitably be lower when we're talking about it. So some good examples of where things go well: the Royal School of Military Engineering in Chatham, some fantastic Georgian and Victorian barrack buildings are where we train our Royal Engineers to do their trade training skills, in full use at the moment, are in brilliant condition. We look after places like Sandhurst very well, but there are examples of historic buildings that sit on training areas. Shrewsbury Ness has some old farms and other buildings that are historic and listed, but it's a live firing training area. You can't have people occupying and living in those buildings, and inevitably they become much harder to manage. So there's a spectrum across it. We have some 688 buildings that are listed, and of those 47 we would assess in poor condition, 26 of which are on the heritage list, and of those 26, 11 of those fall in those training areas where it's almost impossible for us to be able to use them, and that's where the problem arises.
I'm quite surprised by that figure, because I can think of a number of heritage sites within my own constituency alone that would fall into the category of, well, some might say managed decline, others might say neglect. It's very difficult to tell the difference in many cases. I mean, for example, within HMS Sultan, which is a training establishment within my constituency, there are two forts, one of which is Fort Rowner, which has, to my knowledge, no financial investment in terms of maintenance or otherwise at all. And the only purpose it's being used for at the moment is to keep caravans. Does that fall in your list of 26 buildings that are at risk?
It is. It's one of the lists that's on the heritage at risk site.
What would you do? Because that's had no investment at all in either maintenance or keeping it safe. I mean, it's literally crumbling into the ground. So what would be the... If you don't describe that as managed decline, how would you describe it?
what I'm saying is it's not a policy of managed decline. We're not actively choosing to do that. But when you look at Salton as a base, there is a limited budget to maintain all the facilities there. And as the heads of establishment and the Navy, who are the command who run that site, have to make their prioritisation decisions about it, they will, I think, understandably focus on making sure there's heating and hot water for the trainees on that camp to work from, that the teaching facilities are workable, and therefore a historic asset like Fort Rona, which we have not got an operational use for, is difficult for us to spend a lot of money on. It's also quite difficult for us, where we can, we would look to dispose of assets that we don't have a use for, but often these assets are within the curtilage of a camp, and there are security issues and concerns about separating something off. So Fort Rona, I know, sits on the edge of that camp. You could look at rerouting a fence. That would be a very expensive business to do, and that's not something that we currently have the budget for.
I completely understand what you're saying. I mean, HMS Sultan is which I use as an example because I think it exemplifies what we're talking about quite well. It's a naval training establishment. Clearly, the MOD's priority has got to be spending the money on the training, but also of the accommodation for the people that are on the training establishment. Protecting heritage sites comes very low down on the list of priorities, but the fact is this is our nation's heritage. It's not really up to the Royal Navy or the Ministry of Defence to decide whether or not our nation's heritage should be allowed to rot at public expense. So are you happy with this approach? What are the barriers to changing it?
So the biggest barrier is the funding. If we have more funding available, then there's more. Then the prioritisation decisions become easier to make, and there's more money to flow down the list, inevitably. I think the second thing is then about trying to make it easier to do work on these buildings. And you talked to Historic England earlier about planning. We are able to gain planning permission to convert historic buildings for future use, but it's a long and slow process that inevitably adds cost and time. And when we need to do things quickly, our choice would be to not use a historic building because we know that's going to take too much time. So finding a way in which gaining planning permission for repurposing historic buildings can be done quicker, but while balancing the need to maintain that focus on the historic aspects would be helpful. Reducing the cost would be good. So you talked earlier about VAT provision. Again, that would make a massive difference because, again, it would allow our funding to go further.
So the National Trust have suggested a safe harbour scheme where surplus government heritage assets would be transferred to a caretaker organisation with local communities and that could be used on a sort of sustainable reuse project. I mean, for me, the Fort Rana and HMS Sultan is a great example of this, right on the edge of the estate, so could easily be hived off without in any way impacting the operation of the site or the security of the site. Obviously, there's a small matter of the perimeter fence, but other than that, it would be a fairly easy thing to do. But as things stand at the moment, there's no incentive for the HMS Sultan to get rid of it. I mean, I know this because I've spoken to the successive stewards of the site, and they have had no interest whatsoever in disposing of it because they have no obligations to maintain that heritage asset. What would you think if there were about incentives for disposal?
I think that would be helpful. I mean, we have no desire to keep hold of buildings and assets that we don't need and can't make active use on for operational purposes, because clearly that is a liability that we hold. And you're right in pointing out we don't spend as much money on maintaining some of those assets as everyone would wish. If we could move that liability to somewhere else, that would be a good thing for us. So if there are ways of doing it. Now, we aren't aware of... The security implications are clearly important to us as well. So understanding who is going to be occupying those assets. A lot of these historic assets are often in the middle of Portsmouth Naval Base, for example, and that's going to be very difficult for us to find an external organisation that's going to be able to access that. Fort Rana is on the curtilage, on the edge. Could you find a way of enclaving it off the site, yes, possibly, and we'd have to look at that. But we'd need to know that there was somebody who was able to take it on. I think the other aspect of this as well is, though, that, and you touched on this in the earlier evidence session, is that there's no guarantee that somebody taking it on will be able to look after these buildings in the same way. There are examples of government buildings being handed over to developers, and then developers not actually developing them, and then they fall further into decay.
Yeah.
But we certainly we're not holding on to these assets because we want to hold on to them. If there was a way for us to be able to move them into other people's hands who could use them, and that was aligned with the needs of the military alongside, that would be really helpful for us.
I mean, you're in a very fortunate position in some senses, because you don't have to abide by the same rules and regulations as any of the rest of us. If one of us was to take over one of these heritage assets, that was a listed building, we would have regulations that would ensure that we had to maintain it to a certain standard. The local authority would be down on us like a ton of bricks if we were allowing our listed building to decay. Have you worked out what would be the cost to the MOD if you had to maintain the listed buildings within your curtilage to the same standards as the rest of the general public?
We don't have a figure for that, and it would be difficult for us to work it out, because an awful lot of the historic buildings that we have are within establishments and are well looked after, and we don't track the money we spend on that. So we spend a lot of money on looking after historic buildings every year, hundreds of millions of pounds, but I can't give you an exact figure because they're part of a wider establishment number.
You don't have any record of what you spend on maintaining heritage assets?
Not specifically.
Okay.
No.
And then, so that I'm not just focusing my attention on the MOD, Richard, I need to move to you. In Historic England's recent report on the care of the government historic estate, actually it was MOJ that came out the worst evaluated department. What steps are you taking to improve them? You don't have the same excuse that you're behind the wire of something which is of a estate which is doing some sensitive military training. What's the MOJ doing to address this issue?
So I think prisons would definitely count as being behind the wire. So look, so I don't disagree with the position from Historic England. So in wider context, so the MOJ estate is just about a £3.1 billion maintenance backlog. But one of the things we have in flight at the moment is actually updating our condition survey information on the heritage estate, because I don't think we actually have that up-to-date position. I think it's only when we do have that we'll then be able to develop that kind of more strategic plan for bidding for funding, for managing the risk, for managing that element of the estate. I mean, the justice system, I'm sure colleagues will be aware, is one that is under strain and has been for some time. So very much the priority of every penny and pound that we do invest in the estate is very much about keeping prisons and courts operational. And I think the reality is that has had an impact on other things like the heritage estate, and it'd be wrong for me not to see that.
You're doing an evaluation at the moment, and is your take then that the biggest issues on your heritage buildings would be within the prison estate, or is it within the court system?
So overall, we've about just over 185 listed assets across the MOJ estate. About 2/3 of that would be in prisons, and about 75% of that element is actually inside the prison wall. I think we need to really understand the up-to-date condition, what the risk is with that, but also is there potential that we don't necessarily understand. And that might sound weird, and what would you do with something within a prison wall? But there may be things that there may be value that we can drive there. It's not that we aren't spending any money on the heritage estate, and we are engaged with Historic England on where we do that, but it isn't just to sort of give you a specific example. So this year we're spending about 350 million on capital maintenance on the prisons and probation estate. I think it's probably around 1% of that is actually on the heritage estate, which gives you a flavour of just kind of the funding challenge. But also, I think that's got to be set against that wider context of a £3 billion backlog maintenance for the MOJ estate.
Mm-hmm. And to what extent are you liaising with Historic England to try and find solutions to these issues?
Honestly, so one of my own personal reflection leading to, I speak to the CEOs of big construction companies in the UK who are supporting us on building new prisons, and I don't have a relationship as yet with the CEO of Historic England, and that's something that I can and will change. But I say it because it's a reflection of where priorities have been at the minute. You know, providing that vital prison capacity has been such a relentless focus for myself and colleagues in MOJ. It's the unintended consequences is perhaps you're not as consistently engaged with others. And I think as we get this, so that the condition information that I referred to, we should have that later in 2026. And I would see us as engaging Historic England with that information, and how could we collectively in partnership work through some of the challenges that we face.
That's a good idea. I mean, one of them was just here. We can introduce you.
Yeah, we've met.
Excellent. Bye.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to firstly come to yourself, Jenny Randy, regarding sort of like you mentioned about sort of the history, if you like, of some of the sites and the operational use that's relevance which is carried forward to now. And I kind of broke up in a bit of a cold sweat with regards to you mentioning some of those sites, but that was from an earlier life. But certainly, what I wanted to talk about, you spoke about Shoebury Ness, which is in my constituency yourself in Eastern Rochford, and we have the Commandant's building. It's on the boundary of the site, and there's a local community organisation that wants to work with the MOD to sort of repurpose that. And if you go further into sort of Foulness Island, which makes up the majority of the site, if you like, there's a number of farmers there and residents that are on site. And I've been there a few times, spoken to people, and the challenges they have is that the population's dropping, houses are being vacated, and they're not being re-let, and they don't know why. And so, and then adding to that is, that there are a number of sort of like, historic buildings, old farmhouses and stuff like that. So I suppose my question is, you have buildings that are currently being used by farmers and local residents, and then you also have some buildings that are in severe decline or in decline or have been vacated in the last few years that are not being re-let, that are left empty. And so there are people on site already living there, and then there's also additional accommodation that can actually take people. And so what do we do there? I mean, what's the plan with regards to trying to support the community that's there, but also there is a precedent of people living on that site, so why can't we carry on with that?
I can't answer your question directly as to why buildings aren't being re-let when tenants are moving out, and we can certainly take that away. I can find out if there is a particular reason around Shoebury Ness that there's an active policy for us not to do that, and I'll get back to you on that. Because in principle, we would want buildings to be occupied if they can be, because we're responsible as the landlords for their maintenance, and a building that is occupied and in use is always easier to maintain. So I'm afraid I can't really answer that question more directly, but I will take it away if that's okay. Okay,
thank you for that. And I suppose in terms of opportunities, in terms of the public sector, sort of working with sort of private partners to reduce the burden, I fully understand sort of like the cost implications of some of these buildings that are not relevant for current operational use. Are there any plans to sort of work with the private sector to, I suppose, be very creative to try and bring some of these assets that are on the curtilage, effectively can be brought back into sort of like private use, if you like?
So we have examples where we've done that. Medley Manor near Camberley was the officers' mess for the camp. We built a new officers' mess inside the camp, and we're able to then sell that building off. And we do that on a case-by-case basis as and when we can. There is a limited we have a limited capacity in terms of the numbers of staff who are able to deal with asset disposals. And quite a lot of them are focused at the moment on trying to dispose of larger sites. So having the capacity to deal with lots of individual buildings, we lack. So there's, I can understand the frustration of people saying, hey, here's a building, we can see an opportunity for it, why can't the MOD get rid of that? And it may well be in individual circumstances. It's just a question of we'd love to, but we haven't got the staff capacity to move those forward.
Yeah, I mean, because there's obviously there's a financial gain for both parties really as well. So there is a motivation, if you like, for the MOD to, where possible, work with partners in order to sort of like dispose of sites as well.
Yeah, I mean, we recognise, and I think it's mentioned in the Strategic Defence Review published last year, that our estate is too big. We have too many buildings for the size of the military that we need. And that means that the money we have is spread too thinly. So we actively want to reduce the size of our built estate. And if there are good ways of doing that and taking, in this case, historic buildings and passing those on to other users, that is to our advantage as well as to the preservation of those historic buildings. So we're definitely keen to do it.
Brilliant. And my final question, do you have any examples where you've worked with and partnered with private organisations to, I suppose, prevent deterioration, to avoid neglect? Do you have any examples of that?
So, I mean, there's one example in Gosport, the old police station at Haslar, which it's not a completely commercial organisation, but the Hornet Services Sailing Club and the Army Offshore Sailing Association have taken on the rent of a building from the MOD, and that has been fully converted, and it's a fantastic new facility. And it was a building that was was not in use and was falling into disrepair. So there's a good small example there. I can't off the top of my head think of other bigger examples.
But that is also a good example of where a little bit of maintenance would have saved a huge amount of public money. So that was actually the instance I was referring to earlier, where for the sake of not clearing out the gutters and replacing the roof tiles, it required £400,000 worth of Historic England funding, and then much funding from the Army Sail Association to bring that building back into use. And this is a big problem when the military come to dispose of their sites. Actually, they're almost giving them away, in some cases having to give them away with an endowment, because of the huge cost that comes with them in bringing these listed buildings back up to even a legally minimum standard.
Absolutely, and your previous witnesses in the earlier hearing mentioned that getting the running costs of historic buildings is really important. It's very easy to focus on the capital costs of conversion, but if you don't spend enough money on running buildings, and that is true of any buildings in public ownership. So the biggest problem we have in our estate is not having the capital to convert buildings, it's to make sure we're maintaining and sustaining them properly everywhere.
Okay, thank you.
That's it. General, thank you.
Thanks, Squire. Vicky?
The old Royal Naval College is not in my constituency, but it is in a neighbouring constituency, and we'll all know the amount of attraction and so forth that it gets. But they've now had the removal of the grant and aid funding, which is making their financial position really difficult. I believe the MOD is the freeholder of that. So I'm just wondering kind of what plans there are to ensure there is sustainability for the Old Royal Naval College.
So my understanding is that the leaseholder, the leaseholders are responsible for the maintenance of that building, and there isn't an MOD responsibility for that.
So I think so the responsibility has been put on to them, and I think this is sometimes like the wiser question in terms of the responsibilities as well, when there isn't that grant funding for them to be able to survive anymore. And I'm just wondering whether or not there is that collaboration of any sort to make sure that we don't end up losing a major historical building like that.
So the MOD are not planning, as far as I'm aware, to have an involvement in that at the moment.
So then if they are having plans to end up doing something else, like shutting down or whatever, that's just for them, not for the MOD as the freeholder.
I'm not aware of our responsibilities. Okay. There was, I think, the chair asked some PQs around this, and the answers were sort of, under the terms of the lease, the responsibility of the repair and maintenance of the Old Royal Naval College rests with the Greenwich Foundation for the Old Royal Naval College. So that's the MOD's position at the moment. Clearly, if things develop further, then we will have to see where that goes. But at the moment, we don't have a responsibility for the maintenance of that building.
Thank you, Vicky. Natasha.
I'm just going to ask a bit about funding from how you're funding your departments, but then also about future skills and training and things like that for young people, because obviously there's an opportunity for us to use these, public buildings to train young people to fill skills gaps in this area. So what steps are your departments taking to secure adequate and sustainable funding for conservation and maintenance of heritage assets in your estate beyond essential work?
I think it's sort of to pick up from my earlier point. So I think, as I said, I don't think we quite know exactly what we need for the heritage estate at the minute, hence the work we have in flight to understand that condition, and that will allow us to make much more informed future bids. On that funding point, so I think for me it's not just about, it's about investing in the government estate as a whole, with the heritage estate a part of that. But I think if you invest in one thing, you risk it being at the expense of something else. On the skills point, again, so I mentioned earlier that I talked to CEOs of construction firms who are active partners in terms of what we're delivering. We talk about pipelines. So the more clarity we can give on where government departments are going to invest in their estate, that's really helpful and attractive to those companies and helps them with their own investment in skills. And I think there is a broader point about how we invest in the construction industry in the UK as well. So that is definitely an active conversation that we have.
And perhaps it might be helpful, Chair, if I give some broader context to GPA and then I'll address the skills question. So the Government Property Agency, we're an exec agency of the Cabinet Office, formed in about 2018-19, with a mission to deliver a smaller, greener, better government office estate. There's about 220 offices that we oversee in the UK, of which 64 are freehold, the rest are leasehold, so they're not really part of this conversation. Of the freehold, 20 we are heritage assets, and we regard as heritage assets, most of which are located within a stone's throw of here. About 16 of those are in Whitehall. They're valued about £700 million. So very much as part of that objective of the smaller, greener, better office estate, we're focused on ensuring that those Whitehall buildings, those heritage assets, are, provide brilliant working environments for civil servants. I will come to the question, but I think it's possibly helpful context. The funding is always a challenge, but I think it's helpful with these buildings insofar as there's a plan for London. It's a wider business model which enables us to close leasehold buildings, the rents we pay to landlords, and then focus investment on the Whitehall buildings. We've got some great examples of investment then in those Whitehall buildings. So that means that we do have funds to invest then in the continued maintenance, the planned maintenance, and also major projects on each of these buildings. And there's about £75 million being invested in Whitehall over the last 5 years. We plan another 45 as part of this spending review period. So perhaps a little bit much background, but the context is then there's a lot of people involved, both within the GPA. We're about 500 people. There's a team in London who are building skills all the time as we refurbish certain buildings and we maintain buildings. So we're building skills in the Government Property Agency. We work with strategic partners who themselves then provide expertise and themselves train people in these historic buildings and the very specific nature of keeping them maintained. And we obviously then work closely with local authorities in Historic England in making sure that we're complying with all the with all the specifics of the buildings of this nature. So there's a lot of people involved, and that involves then quite a pipeline of skills being built.
And then when you're in the act of procurement for those specialist projects or things like that, is training and apprenticeships specifically focused on heritage and preservation part of that?
So I can't specifically answer that question, but I can say that with the strategic partners that we work with, the construction partners that we work with that carry out some of these works, then yes, from a procurement perspective, we'd need experts we'd need to ensure ourselves and satisfy ourselves that the expertise is there to be able to undertake the work.
So I was using that opportunity to leverage that opportunity to train up the next, you're talking about pipeline, but to use those opportunities to train up the next, craftspeople that could come up behind them. It feels like a good opportunity to do that. We're just keen to understand if that's part of the thinking when we're going out and tendering these contracts.
Yeah, it very much is. I can come back specifically on what our procurement policies are. But yeah, in general, we need the skills to be able to look after these incredibly important buildings.
No? Okay. Okay, well, just finally then, I suppose, do you feel the lack of craftspeople in the industry? Is it something that you kind of recognise, and when you're trying to maintain your estate, is it something that you come up against and you struggle to get projects delivered on time because of things like that?
Not specifically on the heritage estate, but I think that's because we're not investing at a significant level. I think you see wider strain in the construction industry. I think there are particular peak moments where it sometimes feels like departments were all sort of fishing in a similar pond. I think we had that with the rack, the concrete kind of. I think there was a lot. Everyone sort of diverted to manage a particular risk, and I think that probably highlighted there was resource strain in that level in that area. But I just think there's that how we work with industry to ensure there's broader investment in construction. I think that's government departments have a key role in that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're fortunate insofar as there's quite a demand for young, ambitious people to work on the buildings of this kind of calibre. So I just probably can't speak more broadly for the challenges that are referred to, and I know that this committee's there to address.
Thank you, Richard.
I was just going to come in. I think generally we find that there is a shortage of skilled tradesmen across the board. So even in just standard construction, where you've got major construction projects going on, there's quite often competition. And we do find that for particularly where you're looking for very specialist heritage skills, there's a limited market for that. And inevitably these markets and skills develop because there's a demand. So being able to create a pipeline of here are the sort of heritage type activities that will require skills, and therefore to build a supply chain that and trade skills that might be able to do that, is something that maybe collectively government should think about looking at, and that might drive.
It feels to me like, Richard, you've got an opportunity within your department. I mean, bear with me, but we've heard from Historic England about the major skills deficit in maintaining historic buildings. You've got a lot of historic buildings. You've also got a load of offenders in your prisons who are in need of generating skills so that they can have a life in the outside world once they're released from prison. I mean, leave aside the obvious risks of equipping violent offenders with the tools to restore heritage buildings. It seems to me that there's an opportunity within the prison estate to actually develop the much needed heritage maintenance skills that could be used in the outside world. Has anyone ever looked at that?
I mean, I say with a bucket load of pride that there are prison colleagues who have gone on to work for some of the very construction firms that have partnered with this, and that's always something that we are keen to build on. We have people who are released on temporary licence who will go and work on some of our own projects, which I think is quite a powerful thing in that, and how we use that to sort of fulfil and secure future employment. I think we just want to do more of that.
Yeah.
Full stop.
But no one's ever looked specifically at the crafts skills that we're talking about today, where we've heard there's a vast.
Not that I'm aware. I think again it would be under the umbrella of what does the construction industry need.
Might be worth looking at.
Absolutely.
And having a chat with Sturrock England. Okay, thanks. Let's move on to Jeff, please.
Thanks. So Andy and Richard, you both talked about the challenge you have of maintaining heritage assets while you've got the operational requirements, particularly kind of security, but other operational requirements as well. I wonder if there's anything else you'd like to add to that. But leading on to the second question, which is about collaboration, because Historic England have said that because heritage covers so many different government departments, it's kind of quite a diverse set of responsibilities. Historic England have said there needs to be more collaboration. So what opportunities are there, I guess, in the MOJ and MOD in particular, and Mark may want to add to this as well, what opportunities are there for collaboration? How can you work together across the piece? And what would that look like in terms of accountability and coordinating for heritage assets?
So I would say there absolutely is. I would go back to my earlier, so the work we have in flight that will just give us that better grip, visibility and handle on our heritage estate. If our response to that is in isolation, we just look at it as through an MOJ lens, I think the risk is we won't take that forward as much as we could. I want to do it in partnership with Historic England, so we have every intention of we will engage. We'll share, I think, the transparency element, sharing that what that information tells us, because I'm also mindful of the fact that doing this work alone doesn't guarantee that we get the funding to carry out the things that we might want to do in response. But the earlier comment about, for example, partnering with the private sector, I think if we have that stronger collaboration with Historic England, they may be able to point us in the right direction or other opportunities to engage with the private sector that we might not necessarily be aware of.
And from an MOD point of view, we work closely with Historic England. We follow the protocol that they issued around the care of government historic estate. And we have a very small team in my directorate, 2 archaeologists and 3 historical building experts who are our link with Historic England. So we work closely with them as much as we can. In terms of collaboration with other departments, if that's what you were sort of asking as well, I mean, part of the difficulty we have in the MOD is that our estate tends to be geographically dislocated from lots of other things. Lots of our estates in relatively rural locations, so we don't have neighbours nearby. But I think the idea of having a sort of collaborating together to pull together a list of active works on the historic estate, so we could start to produce here's a government pipeline of projects in historic buildings that might then lead into helping industry supply the trades and skills needed for that might be something we should do.
Just a brief point from me. From a collaboration perspective, certainly helpful to mention Office of Government Property and the Chief Government Property Officer, who are the sponsors of the GPA, and they provide a convening function across all property across government. And Mark Chivers, who leads that team, is always very keen to bring us together on various topics and subjects. So that's something actively that we liaise on. I'd also say, just very specifically, on the Whitehall estate, we're clearly learning quite a lot and refurbishing some pretty challenging historic buildings, and I've had a couple of sessions then to swap notes with the House of Parliament Restoration Committee, Russ McMillan, the new Chief Executive. So just to ensure that we are swapping notes and making sure that best practice is spread across the way we work.
Do you think convening function is enough, or do you think swapping notes is enough, or do you think there should be maybe more oversight and control? The impression I'm getting is that MOD, understandably, for example, is sort of managing their estate and all the challenges that comes with it, but as a kind of separate entity from the rest of government. Am I getting the wrong impression there?
We tend to manage our estate relatively separately from the rest of the government property agency, yes.
Is there an opportunity for more kind of oversight and coordination, I guess? I'm asking Mark, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. Our remit is pretty focused on the government office estate. I fully embrace the principle of best practice, collaboration, and working across departments. And as I say, Mark Chivers, who oversees government property, the Chief Government Property Officer, I know were he here would absolutely endorse that cross government property collaboration. That's why that team is there in Cabinet Office, to drive just that.
Just to be clear, there's nobody in the Cabinet Office who kind of oversees or works in partnership with organisations like the MOJ and the Ministry of Defence to keep an eye on what they're doing with their heritage estate. Everyone's just pretty much left to their own devices. Is that basically what you're saying?
We all are very clear on the need to maintain planned maintenance, maintain buildings, and there's some very clear guidance that comes from OGP for all of us on maintenance protocols, how we deal with backward maintenance.
These guys aren't doing it,
specific heritage, not that I'm aware of, and that's DCMS.
Historic England have said that. No offence to Richard and Andy, but their departments are not maintaining their heritage assets. Otherwise, Andy wouldn't have 27 on the Heritage at Risk register. So there's no oversight from the Cabinet Office to make sure that these guys are doing what they're supposed to be doing when it comes to following Historic England guidelines.
I can't speak for the Office of Government Property at the heart of Cabinet Office. There's an exec agency of the Cabinet Office delivering that strategic planning of the smaller, greener office estate. I can't really comment on that question.
Who would we need to get in front of us to be able to answer a question like that then? The Minister?
So the Chief Government Property Officer is Mark Chivers, who I think would have a view, for sure.
Why is he not here?
We asked him.
I don't know, have we asked him? Yeah. Why is he not here? You don't know?
Well, certainly the work that GPA do as part of the Cabinet Office we thought would be particularly interesting for the committee in the context of the heritage work on the Whitehall estate. So that's certainly why.
Just tell Mr. Chivers we might have to invite him to come in all by himself so he can come and answer these questions directly. Let's move. Thank you. Sorry, Jeff. I do apologise.
That's fine.
Let's move on to Damien.
Would it be right to say that one public estate certainly is a phrase? Is it anything more than a phrase?
I mean, that you're referring to the Cabinet Office programme.
We're told now, and by the way, I'm not saying this is a brand new thing. That phrase has been around in government for quite some time. Including, I was at the MOJ for a while. People talked about one public estate, and sometimes in relation to meeting government housing priorities, but also just securing best value for taxpayers' money. But it sounds from what you're saying like there's not really an active programme to treat the asset register of HM government as one thing. Is that fair to say?
No, I don't think that is fair to say. I mean, one public estate, there was a specific Cabinet Office-led programme, which is very much, there's a regional focus to it, and it's about trying to maximise the value of the government estate in that particular region, particularly where it can contribute to economic growth, and etc. On the management of the government estate, so I think there is a concerted effort now. So we've had the NAO report that talks about the backlog for the central government estate being around sort of £49 billion, and if that isn't addressed in a sustainable, systematic way, the risk is that will continue to grow. So there is much more join up in that space. That isn't to say there isn't more that we can do in that space. And just on the earlier question, we're also property leaders in government. There isn't actually anything stopping me from engaging with MOD and forming those closer relationships. And I kind of take responsibility for that.
There's usually nothing stopping anybody in any government department working with any other. That doesn't mean they necessarily.
I think my point is
they get out and do it.
My point is there isn't any formal mechanism that's stopping that.
Okay.
And I think I'd also add there's a lot of investment gone in from colleagues in Office of Government Property in forming a database and a more robust database of government assets. So no, I think there's plenty of work being done to connect across government, and but whether it's specifically on heritage, given all the other pressures that are that on funding, is a fair question.
I mean, another thing that comes up on property periodically and is perhaps particularly relevant to heritage sites is about offloading property, particularly to unlock housing development, but it can be for other things as well. And at Borden, I used to represent in the constituencies I used to represent, the Remy site at Borden, where there's been substantial redevelopment, had some marginal involvement with Reading prison and so on. Could you be doing a lot more? And I say, you two, I mean, you just happen to be the ones who are here. You both have big estates. But, I mean, could government departments in general be doing more to offload sites? And particularly, in the secure estates, I mean, it's wonderful to think of all these listed buildings, but the truth be told, they are the hardest buildings to manage. They've got the darkest corners. They were designed for the Victorian era, not for now. They're expensive to heat. They're expensive to run. Is enough done to offload property when you could and replace it with more modern property? And so as individual departments, who challenges you to say, why have you not got rid of that site? Why are you still spending a fortune maintaining that site?
So from an MOD perspective, we are actively trying to reduce the size of the estate. We're investing a lot of money in doing so. So the Defence Estate Optimisation Programme is a sort of £4.5 billion programme to relocate military units onto a smaller, more concentrated estate so that we can dispose of land. And that will reduce our running costs, it'll give us new and better facilities, and it'll release land for housing development. And of course, the current government are particularly keen that we accelerate that process. So we're under a lot of pressure from the government to actively release. In doing that, considerations of historic assets on those sites sometimes become they're an active concern that you have to consider in how you do it. So we have a service level agreement with Historic England for the Defence Estate Optimisation Programme. So we've got their expert advice on how we handle those particular assets on those sites as we dispose of them. But of course, there are all sorts of other things that are not related to historic assets that make it harder to sell land. There's planning law, local planning permission, so planning reform, and we've been actively engaged in the government's approach to planning reform to try and make it easier to offload land and then make it useful for other things and for other purposes across the communities.
And to just follow up on that and answer the question, again, our colleagues at OGP have a specific objective and targets to coordinate disposal of land across all departments for all of us. And indeed, you heard from the Chief Exec of Historic England that they're working together to ensure that where those heritage assets are disposed, they fall in the right hands and not the wrong hands, has been a theme.
Actually, Mark, I wanted to press you on something related but different, which is hotel room stock. So you own some of the most valuable real estate in Europe on these roads immediately adjoining here. And sometimes when you've done projects in the past, the Treasury building in particular was was a fantastic sort of concentration of working space. I don't know what the ratios were of how many more people you got into that space. But my question is, how much more opportunity is there in central London government property to reduce the footprint of that office space? Well, in theory, many of those people don't need to be working in central London, but we could do with an awful lot more hotel room stock in central London.
Yeah, it's significant. We are currently in the middle of an initiative called the Plan for London. It's going to involve closing 11 principally leasehold buildings, notably of which is Petit France, Merger, which
not the prettiest building in central London, but let's
which has been
dwell.
which has been sold to a hotel developer.
Right.
So, to answer your question, the economics of that really stack up as well. There's a target 94 million of annualised revenue savings by closing those buildings, and then having a more focused core set of buildings in Whitehall, which I've described the refurbishments on those. So I think by handing back that leasehold property, the stuff that's the old offices which aren't really fit for purpose in the context of government, I think it's a good reuse.
And finally, if I might be allowed one more question, just wearing your kind of broader public sector stewardship hat, do you think it's right that you're effectively obliged always to sell to the highest bidder? I think right back to, do you remember, I can't remember, over there I guess it is, when County Hall was being sold, there was a big question about whether it should go to the LSE or should go to London School of Economics or go to a sort of general commercial developer. I always felt in a funny sort of way that was an opportunity missed to create something amazing in the centre of this, something new in the centre of this city. But I also, when I've come across projects in different government departments, you just don't have the ability to say it would be great to do X with this site. You basically have to follow government procurement rules, of course, and so on. Do you think we sometimes lose something as a result?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's, as we talked about,
it was a leading question.
It really was. I think you ought to be really careful really careful who you sell to. I spent my career developing or regeneration through retail and leisure in the centre of towns. I did a couple of years at Liverpool City Council and oversaw some of the consequences of moving buildings on to the wrong people. So absolutely, it's really important to sell to the right people. I think typically, one doesn't. It's easy not to take the social value associated with a sale into a sale. So I think your leading question is one that I think Historic England, OGP, and we all are very aware of.
Yeah, I think there's something right, not just looking at the government estate through the lens of cost, and more through the lens of value and its contribution to, in my case, for example, justice outcomes, as opposed to often it's the cost of the bricks and mortar and the running of it. It's that kind of, I think there's more we need to do to demonstrate the economic value of the government estate.
And there's a tendency when you're disposing of something to focus on the capital receipt you might get from it, but what you ignore is in our case, what we're actually interested in is reducing our running costs over time and the liabilities, and if we factor that in, that's a big financial bill. So taking a slightly lower capital receipt in order to get it into the hands of somebody who will look after it will reduce our running costs. So it's maximising value we should be thinking about, not maximising the receipt and the capital receipt for the same.
When it comes to maximising value, do you think that government departments think in an agile way about, is it we're either flogging this or we're keeping it, or is there ever a consideration of a kind of hybrid model where you might work collaboratively with the private sector, sell a bit, keep a bit, to maximise the potential value of something?
So it's not directly relevant to historic estate, but right at the moment the MOD is we had the housing review that completed last year, and we're about to create an organisation to take on the running of our service families accommodation, but with that also the development of land that's released for disposal. And the principle behind that is, rather than, what we've done traditionally is we've tried to get land that was surplus into local planning applications and then sell it to developers who will take it on. And by putting it in, getting outline planning permission, we've increased the value. But what this concept will do is take us a bit further, and for the right sites, we will partner with a developer and maintain MOD ownership of that longer and extract more value from it. Now, that sort of model could be applied in other circumstances as well, potentially.
I mean, I'm thinking, again, I mean, I don't want to give the impression that you can't swing a cat in my constituency without knocking down half a dozen listed buildings on military estate, but you can't swing a cat in my constituency with that. So Fort Blockhouse, which, as you know, is earmarked for disposal, has been since 2016, I think, and we're still, you know, everyone's still twiddling their thumbs waiting to figure out how to dispose of it. Complex site, you know, listed buildings, seawall, some elements of contamination, some planning constraints, etc., and proximity to naval base as well. But that, I mean, one of the reasons I think that hasn't been sold so far is that it's a huge estate, and the approach has always been sell it, keep it, sell it. But we're still, you know, sitting there waiting for an outcome for this site, which is doing nothing for the constituency, nothing for the MOD, nothing for the public purse. Could there be a slightly more sophisticated hybrid model in the approach to how you get rid of something like that?
So we are looking at that, you'll be pleased to know. So some soft market testing was conducted a year and a half ago. 29 firms, and this was a mixture of housing development, housing associations, commercial development and maritime development firms. 29 initially expressed an interest, 3 then took that forward, 2 turned up to the face-to-face. Of those, 1 was not suitable. The other one we've had a conversation with, and the judgment is that, as you've said, a straightforward sale is just not going to work. It's not attractive enough. So we are now looking at considering how do we come up with some form of model of partnering where department stays more involved, but we are starting to think about how the development works. Now, it's very early days in that. I don't know what success we will have, but we have recognised that a straightforward sale of that site is unlikely to be successful.
No, I mean, it's a shame that's been earmarked for disposal now for 10 years, though. I mean, but that's a lot of cost that could have been saved if that had been recognised 10 years ago. But there's an element of urgency about that now, is there?
Yes.
Okay. Watch this space in that case. Jo?
Thank you. So mine's on planning application and listed building consent. And during the evidence, we heard from numerous organisations how slow and fragmented this process is. So I want to find out, does this process provide sufficient flexibility for publicly owned assets with operational requirements? So how do you get around it?
So from a military perspective, we have no exemption. So although we have permitted development rights under some circumstances within the fence line of our military bases, that it excludes development of historic buildings. So immediately we come back into the same planning rules and regulations. And where we are faced with an urgent estate requirement, an urgent operational requirement that requires infrastructure, we would find a place that avoided using historic building, to put that simply because we know that getting the planning application to put something in a historic building would take too long. So we generally don't have an approach of urgent requirements related to historic buildings because we have a big enough estate that there's somewhere else you could go. Now that may mean you've missed an opportunity to use a historic building for an alternative purpose that might have benefited that building. So, but I can't say that that's the case. I don't know of any specific examples where we could have used this but we didn't. But that might be true.
Can I just finish? I'll ask you as well, Richard. So how are there any changes that you would like to see to improve the balance between heritage protection and functional adaptability in this process?
It's really difficult, isn't it? Because, of course, I could sit here and go, well, we'd like complete freedom to do the sensible and right things with these historic buildings to keep them purposeful. But understandably, the system has to have a certain amount of control in it. So getting that balance between making sure that people, landlords and owners of buildings are looking after them properly, while that not then becoming a hindrance to developing it is a really fine balance.
Are you in conversation with government departments regarding these limitations to...
So we have been involved quite heavily in the new planning development, but not specifically on the issue of historic buildings.
Is that something that you'll look to do?
I'm not aware of our plans to do anything in that regard specifically, because it's not... While planning permission for historic buildings is a slow process, and it does slow us down when we're dealing with those, we have so much of our estate that's not historic buildings that it's not a priority for us.
Okay. And same question, Richard.
Yeah.
So again, how do you manage the situations where urgent operational needs require expedited consent? So how do you manage that?
So look, in terms of planning, the big thing for us tends to be when we're trying to get planning for a new prison, and that's not without its challenges, but we're doing okay. Listed building stuff tends to be more in the courts and tribunal space. So I think some of the volumes, I think there might be, I can double check, but I think it's above 60 potentially sort of live consent applications. I think we recognise you have to have a system. I think it's more about its proportionality and response time. But actually, one of the things that could potentially help. So my earlier point on, again, that without wanting to sound about a broken record, the more we understand about the condition of our heritage estate, and therefore are able to make more informed bids, and then you have greater clarity on funding, that allows you to plan your work better, and the listed building element as part of that. So I think there's in getting that information, we can then be more clear and provide more clarity on our plans, which I think can help local authorities and things, for example.
Yeah, so it's understanding the process a little bit more, so that you can do the challenge. Okay.
Recognising it's unhelpful if we just provide a load of stuff at once, because there's resource strain and pressure elsewhere.
Okay. Is there anything that you, again with the...
Yeah, I think in the context of an urgent health and safety repair requirement, then we do have flexibility to operate within the guidelines to address an issue and then retrospectively apply for consent. It's really rare for that to happen. There's one or two instances across the Whitehall estate, but typically we'd work closely then with Westminster Council to ensure that we were complying. In terms of involvement directly with any of the legislation, I'm reflecting on the conversation, and I'll take that away as one to follow up.
Thanks, Joe. Finally, Bio.
Thank you, Chair. So in the evidence, the Historic England suggested that the transferring publicly owned assets and the ownership of that sort of into sort of community use. Do you think this is a sort of logical solution? Is this a way forward? And I'll start with Mark and then Richard.
Yeah, thank you. To the extent of my role at the Government Property Agency, it's not a relevant question that it's not a question that would typically be relevant to the Whitehall estate. So stepping back and providing, I guess, a broader view on this, having been involved in community asset transfer type work and seen that operate in cities, and particularly in Liverpool, I think as long as you understand the community that's taking it on, the business model, the ability to effectively service the requirements of the building, is a really important part of that transfer. Also really important to understand the social value associated with a transfer like that, beyond the pure capital value, with the type of issues that I've historically seen. But I don't speak with my GPA chief exec hat on in answering that question, because it's not necessarily relevant, but hopefully helpful.
That's good. Some context, definitely. Yeah. Richard?
Yeah, so I would say, it would be challenging in so much as so much of our heritage estate is one, operational, but two, actually located inside a secure prison perimeter. So I think there's a practical element to it. That's not to say that if there are future opportunities where we're looking to dispose of elements of the heritage estate, that you know, we need to be completely broad in our thinking, and I would go back to that. I think that engagement with Historic England and that partnership can help us. I think that's the relationship that we need to build on to help us do that.
Definitely, and I know, General Andy, I know it's probably harder for yourself, be it because of security issues, but is that something that you would consider and look at?
Yeah, like the MOJ, as Richard says, you know, it wouldn't be appropriate for a lot of our estate, a lot of our historic buildings because of the security implications. But on a case-by-case basis, where an asset could be taken outside the camp or was already outside the camp, certainly something we'd look at. Is it going to be a significant shift for us? I don't think so. It'll be a sort of a case-by-case basis, but we'd certainly be open to it.
Yeah, and I suppose you've got the issue, it's very much sort of location dependent as well. So if you look at sort of coastal communities, you look at some rural communities where sort of tourism is a piece, you know, where that's quite important. Those kind of assets, if and when and how they can be sort of put back into community use is something that would be important. I mean, we have something similar in Rochford with a Victorian freight house, which is, you know, it's gone back into community use as well. So that's something definitely as and when. So I suppose working with Historic England, how can we do that? Even on a case-by-case basis, that's something that very much needs to be sort of expedited.
Yeah, I think one of the things for us would be identifying a community group that was able to take something on. So it's sort of, if Historic England can do the matchmaking, we'll be happy to look at case-by-case basis. Absolutely,
and even from a local authority point of view, I think they would be sort of tuned into what kind of groups there are out there. I've set some up myself in my constituency, but local authorities will be able to. I'm sure colleagues around the table will be able to as well. So I think tapping into that local sort of government sort of arm would be something that I would definitely commend.
Thanks, Brian. So, as you'll all be aware, we'll be writing a report from our select committee on this subject. If there was one recommendation that would significantly help you in your stewardship of the heritage estate within your own department, what would be the one thing that you would ask us to include, Mark?
Supporting the consolidation, the smaller, greener, better government office estate, disposing of leasehold assets to enable us to invest in the freehold assets for a core, better office estate.
That should be the government focus. The cabinet office focus.
Yeah, relating to I'd give that relating to the office estate.
Okay, Richard.
So recognising funding's always going to be a challenge, but I would describe sustainable levels of funding that span over multi-spending review periods.
Okay, so certainty and predictability of future.
It just helps build pipelines.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Thank you, Andy.
And I would agree with Richard that finances are the core of it, but VAT, the removal of VAT on the refurbishment of historic assets would be really helpful. And it would also play into the sustainability agenda because the motivation to build new puts more embodied carbon out there, whereas reusing existing buildings from an embodied carbon perspective is a more sound policy. So that would help us make our money go further.
Lovely. Thank you very much to all of you for giving evidence to us today. Thank you, team. Order.
Thank you.